Why can't we ever just have a card that stays intact and none of the fights fall off? You get an extremely stacked card like this, and of course, fights have to fall off. Of course, a fight has to fall off, and it can never be perfect. This is just, man, this is just the fight business. But yeah, so we had two reportedly canceled fights over last night and today, which I want to get into. Carlos Prates and Jamahal Hill fights are reportedly off the table. So I want to start with this UFC 314 crazy card, incredibly stacked card when they announced all these fights. But of course, a fight needs to fall off the card, and that is the Carlos Prates and Geoff Neal card as of right now. It was reported last night on the UFC broadcast that from John Anik that Geoff Neal got injured and the fight is canceled, and apparently Carlos Prates won't even have a replacement. They don't know yet if he will stay on this card or not with a new challenge, but that they have some fight news regarding him soon. So as of right now, Carlos Prates is off UFC 314 and will not have a replacement. And they'll probably announce him on some other card. But yeah, this whatever, I was really looking forward to this. All these fights back to back to back, finally like a super stacked card. And I told myself that even if one of these fights falls off, it's still an incredible card when you got Yair Rodriguez versus Pitbull and Bryce Mitchell, Gene Silva, Pimblett Chandler, and Volk versus Lopez. But the Prates fight fit beautifully on this card. Prates in Miami. Carlos Prates is a surging star right now. He has that aura and momentum, and he has this swagger and aura right now that is probably the best thing in the welterweight division at this point. He's one of my favorite fighters in the UFC. For sure my favorite fighting nerd, and he was supposed to fight alongside his fighting nerd brother, Gene Silva, back to back. So this was going to be a big moment for the both of them on this Miami card. And Carlos Prates, he's so swag. Like, this guy smokes and drinks, and he's still doing things that he's doing in the octagon. He went 4-0 in his UFC run in 2024. Knocked out his body in the Contender Series, came into the UFC, been knocking dudes left and right with that power. The Leech, Ling Yang, whatever the hell his name is, that guy Miles, Trent, whatever, and then also Neal Magny, who was an old deteriorating gatekeeper in welterweight that they fed to Carlos Prates to have a showcase performance in a Fight Night main event. So that propelled Carlos Prates' hype a little bit more, and this was going to be a big spot for him to be on this Miami card, in the main card, to go on in there and hopefully style on Geoff Neal, who was a little bit of a step up in competition. Geoff Neal just beat RDA, but he also got destroyed by Shavkat, and he's been up and down, but he's a dangerous welterweight with that number 10 ranked spot. So Carlos Prates was coming to this fight looking for a big step up in competition and bypassing Geoff Neal, hopefully with a highlight KO. What I really like about Carlos Prates is, and from what I've seen from his fights, is he stays patient with it. He hunts for his looks and his strikes. He stays patient. That's kind of what he did with Neal Magny. He was hunting for the kill. He was hunting for that big shot, and he found it later in the round. He got a little bit tested by Neal Magny, trying to shoot some wrestling and whatever, trying to kind of keep him compressed. But Carlos Prates ultimately prevailed, not with much adversity. He kind of was controlling the entire first round, and then boom. And it didn't even look like Carlos Prates connected on that shot on Neal Magny. So that just went to display the level of power this guy could have. He knocked out every single one of his opponents in all four of his fights in 2024. So Carlos Prates has all the hype right now. Part of the fighting nerds who are probably the best fighting group in the UFC right now. And this was a sick fight to have, but as of right now, we don't know what's going to happen if they keep him on this card or not. As of right now, he's not going to be on this card. So I hope that they give him an even bigger opponent. Maybe they'll give him like Ian Gary or something. And yeah, Geoff Neal had to get injured, so Carlos Prates is off of UFC Miami 314. The next fight cancellation. Khalil Rountree versus Jamahal Hill. Now, if you remember, this fight was originally supposed to happen at UFC 303, under the McGregor versus Chandler fight. And that got canceled. And then Rountree was supposed to fight Carlos Ulberg. And then that got canceled. And then Ulberg versus someone else, and Ulberg fell off. So it ended up being an Anthony Smith versus Roman Dolidze fight or something. So this fight was rebooked for UFC Kansas City. Both guys are coming off a loss. Jamahal Hill to Yuri Prohaska and Khalil Rountree in that war versus Alex Pereira, where he got a lot of respect from a lot of people with that performance. And that's why the UFC kind of wants to give him another big spot here. But this main event reportedly is off by Jamahal Hill, who got injured again. Another injury by Jamahal Hill that has ended up ruining a fight. Now, if you remember, Jamahal Hill got injured in the first time they rebooked this fight. And he also, of course, fought Alex Pereira right after a year layoff because he tore his ACL. So Jamahal Hill keeps on getting injured. You know, he used to be a fan favorite back when he was knocking out Glover Teixeira and got the belt. Ever since he came back, he's been kind of, not so liked in the UFC public. He's been too cocky. He's been saying things. He's been acting all this and that. And he just had a big loss, a competitive loss, but a loss to Yuri Prohaska at 311, where Yuri Prohaska finished him. So Jamahal Hill is still looking to bounce back. A former light heavyweight champion versus Khalil Rountree, who's a top-ranked guy. And this was a great main event for UFC Kansas City. It made complete sense. Great main event, but now it is reportedly off because Jamahal Hill got injured. So will they find a replacement for Khalil Rountree for this main event? This card definitely needs some kind of replacement fight. I mean, Anthony Smith and Zhang Miang, Gigi Jikadze, like, the guys on this card aren't enough to cover what the main event should have been. So even though the undercard is kind of good, it's good for a fight night. Ikram Askarov, Randy Brown. They need a new main event for UFC Kansas City. So I'm curious what they're going to do for this. Again, another great fight that was now canceled for the second time, reportedly. Yeah. So that is unfortunate. That is the UFC news right now. And while we're at it, I just want to quickly recap UFC Mexico that just happened last night. So, yeah, Steve Erceg is just on a huge downfall right now. This guy went from challenging Pantoja for the belt in a competitive fight, and he's been in competitive fights, but then he got finished by Kai Kara France in his last fight, and now his third straight loss versus Brandon Moreno. You just had to think that Brandon Moreno was always going to... But Steve Erceg came to fight. He looked good in the exchanges. He arguably won 2 rounds. Maybe you were thinking it was 2-2 going into the 5th. But Brandon Moreno, just the excellent guy that he is. Apparently he's been in 10 straight 5-round fights. So this guy has all the experience and depth to go to the deep waters in a fight. He's looking really, really good. He's looking really crisp on the feet with his striking. He looked even better in this fight than he did against Amir Albazi. I mean, he looked really good there, but he also looked really good here with his right hook. He rocked Steve Erceg. He wasn't letting Steve Erceg have any leadway. Even when Steve Erceg found success with getting an opening into Brandon Moreno followed up with either a jab to the body or that right hand to the top of the dome. Not so much leg kicks by Brandon Moreno, those nice ninja kicks that he does, but Brandon Moreno looked really clean and did just enough to get the win. So Steve Erceg back to the drawing board. They really should cut this guy a break, give him a couple, lesser guys to help him re-establish himself, regroup, and then, they just keep on feeding him to much higher level guys. And unfortunately, Steve Erceg is not coming out on top. If he loses like 2 more, they might just cut him. And he's a good guy, but I always thought Steve Erceg is overrated. So for Brandon Moreno, what is this, his 3rd straight win or something? Coming off the win versus Amir Albazi, coming off the win versus Steve Erceg. Brandon Moreno should get a title shot next. But the current champion has already beaten him twice. And one of those times was for the belt. So with Brandon Moreno, I feel like you got to just give him a break, let him sit until Pantoja's booked for his next fight. See what happens with Pantoja's next fight, whether they give him Kai Kara France, Manel Kape. Maybe a long shot on Merab versus Pantoja main event. Brandon Moreno, right now you just got to kind of keep him on the shelf and waiting for a big... You got to save him for UFC Mexico, UFC Noche. They just announced last night that UFC 320 is going to be also another UFC Noche event. It's September 13th. It lines up. So they're doing it in a new area of Mexico. I'm not going to try pronouncing it, but you have to imagine they'll keep a lot of the fighters that were on this card for that card, which is in a couple months. The timeline works out. So Brandon Moreno, who knows what you do with him, because the Pantoja fight does not make sense right now. something we've seen before twice. I don't know how hyped that would be for the trilogy, but maybe. Then Manuel Torres, I don't know. It was kind of a, flip of the coin decision for me to just pick Drew Dober. I was kind of joking when I picked him. Didn't really have the right say on who would win this fight, but Manuel Torres rocked him in the first round so bad that Drew Dober, he was rocked. He was wobbled, and he fell on the ground, and he thought that the fight might have still been going on. He got back up, and Manuel Torres just kept on hitting him on the side of the head, and he took so much damage, extra damage, before the ref called it, and he got up, and he thought the fight was still going on, and Manuel Torres was like, oh, let's go. You still want to go? So savage KO by Manuel Torres. A lot of the Mexican fighters won on this card. A lot of finishes. It was actually really good decisions on the card. So Manuel Torres gets the win. Fantastic knockout. Drew Dober, yeah, this guy, keep him on the prelims. Edgar Chavez and CJ Vergara ends up getting moved up to the main card because Joe Pyfer had to pull out of his fight hours before due to illness. Another fight being canceled hours before the event. It really puts the UFC in a bad place when this happens, but must have been weight cut issues. Edgar Chavez gets a very good showcase win versus CJ Vergara. Vergara ain't the best opposition, but again, Chavez hopefully will make a name for himself. They'll probably put him on the next Mexico Noche. Raul Rosas Jr., as expected, got the decision win, but in the third round was was put in two very tight chokeholds by Vince Morales, and you almost thought he was going to tap. Really impressive, though, by a guy who's 21 years old, that he had that kind of challenge and he stuck with it and won the fight. He's 11-1 now. That was really impressive to see him withstand those submissions. So Raul Rosas Jr. continues to win. And Vince Morales, yeah. And then David Martinez gets the win. I thought Ronaldo Rodriguez would get the win, and Kevin Borjas ends up winning. But Ronaldo Rodriguez, he got rocked in that first round, but he somehow got up. He stayed in it. That was pretty crazy. He just rolled with the punch and got back on his feet. He's like, let's go. So, and then Atiba Gutierrez. So this was his debut. This guy looks crazy. This guy looks like a future Francis Ngannou. Crazy knee to Jose Medina. So that was a great way to introduce yourself to the UFC. And maybe this guy could be a future middleweight star. He's only 22 years old, bro. And this guy looks scary. And then Marquez Alcasta gets the win. And yeah, majority of the Mexicans had a good night on this card. So that is my recap on UFC Mexico. But again, 2 fight cancellations reportedly. And we'll see how the UFC works their magic to kind of fix this.